I'm Tony Vance. I'm from Temple University, and I'm happy to present this work on behalf of my co-authors at UC Boulder and Brigham Young University. And together, we are members of the Neurosecurity Lab, and we study security and privacy issues using tools and knowledge from the field of neuroscience. Now, first, I want to show you these two images, and I want to test you which of these two is a security message. Technically, only one is, although you might argue that a notice to install Java might also be a security message. So maybe that's a trick question. But only one of these is. And yet, both messages have a very similar look and feel. And the danger is, referencing the title of this paper, The Fog of Warnings, is that you might see notifications that are harmless, benign, but you see many of them, and you might habituate to those notifications. And then the threat is that that habituation might carry or bleed over to rare security messages. So I thought about this when I noticed my 2-year-old son using an iPad. So there's no sound there, but you can see that he just automatically dismissed that message. And I think part of the problem here is we have user design guidelines published from major software companies like Apple, like Microsoft, and others that explicitly train developers to make all user interface design elements visually similar and consistent. And yet, in the realm of security and privacy, that can have, I'm arguing, detrimental effects. And I'm not the only one to make this argument. We've had arguments like this in the past. This is from CACM over 10 years ago, where this observation, the same observation was made. And this author, West, says that security messages often resemble other message dialogues. And as a result, security messages may not stand out in importance, and users often learn to disregard them. And we've seen this with other studies. Other studies have made this argument. In this case, looking at EULAs, and their argument is that people are just trained to dismiss EULAs, and that trained behavior might carry over to other things like security messages. But again, these two papers are conceptual. They didn't actually empirically test this. And then we have empirical papers like this one by Serge Egelman and Laurie Krainer, who noticed that in their study of phishing warnings, that some people disregarded particular phishing warnings because they mistook those warnings for a previous warning they had seen. And so they arrived at a wrong conclusion that they could safely ignore those phishing warnings. So again, that's a very interesting observation, but that was an incidental observation. It wasn't the focus of the study. And so what we set out to do in this study is to explicitly look at the question, can people habituate to notifications, and can that habituation carry over to a new context, specifically rare security messages? So habituation has been studied for a long time in the usable security community, but it's been studied even longer in neuropsychology, over 100 years. And the definition in this space, in this field, is decreased response to repeated stimulation. And it's observed in all animal life, even simple organisms like the California sea slug. And it's been observed in the human brain. And in our previous work, we've shown that people habituate to security messages, and it's very clear from neural activity in the brain. Just after a few exposures, people habituate to security messages. You only have a few chances to get people's full attention to a unique, unseen message. But here's the rub again. So what if your security message is not unique, even though you've only shown it once? And that's because a user has habituated to notifications that have nothing to do with security in other contexts. And again, back to neuropsychology, this phenomenon is called generalization of habituation. And in fact, in this seminal paper from the 60s, these authors outline 9 characteristics of habituation. And one of these they call generalization. It means that habituation to one response or response to one stimulus carries over to other stimuli that share some similarities. So our research question is, does habituation to non-security related notifications generalize to security warnings? And does the degree of look and feel similarity influence the amount of generalization of habituation. Okay. So again, we're drawing on habituation theory, and it's really simple. It works like this. A person encounters a stimulus, and a mental model is created to represent that stimulus. And the next time a similar stimulus is encountered, it's compared to the mental model. And if it matches, then habituation increases. And whatever response will be made will be inhibited. And eventually, you'll see a lack or a decreased response. And on the other hand, if you encounter a stimulus that doesn't match your mental model, then you will mentally amend your model, and then you will become sensitized to the stimulus, and the response will be, the inhibition will be released. And so that behavior will increase, the response will increase. And this is the basic framework we're working from to look at this problem. So with our method we used was an online field experiment. So there's nothing neuro in this next part, although there is something that follows at the end. And in this online experiment, we used the Firefox browser with Mechanical Turk. So we had people's own browsers at home, doing whatever, wherever they do it. And we had over 600 participants. And in this experimental task, we used something we've used in our past studies. We tell the subjects that we would like you to classify images, whether those images are photographs or drawings of Batman, just to keep it interesting. So in this case, they'd say this is an image, and if they do this, they get a performance indicator after every single classification. So it looks like this. There's a progress bar. They have 10 seconds to classify this. If they successfully classify all the images, they receive a bonus on top of the money that we pay them to do this experiment. But in addition to this notification, this performance notification that tells them how well they're doing, we mix in these security messages. So one of them is a privacy permission notification. In this case, location. Will you allow us to select your current location? And this is by design very similar to the notification, the performance notification that we give them. And then we have some notifications that are less visually similar, like an extension message, which is a little bit bigger. So in this case, this is mixed in with these other notifications. What's interesting about this design is that we tell them this is an iframe. And inside this iframe, you're going to be automatically brought to random sites around the web, and we don't have control over what sites you visit. And so if those sites prompt you to do something, that's not us. We tested for realism, and they believed quantitatively and also qualitatively when we talked to them that this was the case, that they were being brought all over the web to look at images, which sounds really scary. But again, we restricted them to Batman images. So this design is, we showed them 15 performance notifications. And we compared that to showing a security message at the 15th position at the very end after they've become habituated to this performance notification, and also comparing a security message at the very first position before they see any performance notifications. And that delta, the difference between these two conditions, is partial evidence of generalization. And then we had some other warnings that don't look similar at all to those performance notifications, but you do see in Firefox like a request to download a binary file and a request to open a macro-enabled spreadsheet. And if you got one of these messages from a random website you encounter on the web, hopefully you wouldn't click on these. So this is what it looks like in the task. So we're really testing for two things here. One is, does generalization happen? And second, does the similarity of those warnings affect the extent to which generalization happens? But we also wanted to rule out fatigue. And in the warning literature, sometimes habituation is synonymously used with the term warning fatigue. But they're not the same. In fact, in neurobiology, they're definitely not the same. In fact, one of the tests of habituation happening is if you rule out the possibility of fatigue. If someone habituates to something and they're not tired, then that's definitely habituation. So as an example here, let's say I show you a stimulus. At the very first exposure, you might have attention that's relatively high on this y-axis. And over time, you would see this classic J curve. This represents habituation. Over time, you'll devote less and less attention to that particular stimulus. And if I show you a new stimulus, then attention should go up to where it was at the beginning of this task. If generalization is happening, if these two stimuli are similar, then that attention won't be near the top. It'll be somewhere down below. And that difference between where attention was in the beginning and where that new stimulus is, that's generalization. We can measure that difference. But this alone doesn't tell you anything about fatigue. So there is a possibility that someone's just tired. Well, that's when you bring in a foil, a really novel stimulus that looks nothing like the others, in this case represented by a rubber duck. And if you can see that one attention that rubber duck is high, like the first stimulus was in the beginning, and at the same time you see generalization to this other effect, then that's really strong evidence that generalization is happening. So we also had a foil in our case, and we also used a rubber duck. And two of my colleagues are from Pittsburgh. This is some giant rubber duck that was shown there. It looked random enough to show to people, just to make sure it's different from everything else they were seeing in this experiment. And we measured fatigue. We showed this foil at the very beginning of the task and compared this at the very end of the task. All right, so we had 10 fully crossed conditions. And our dependent variables were habituation. And we measured this in two ways. One, we used mouse cursor tracking to see how quickly people moused to the warnings or notifications to dismiss them. And in our previous research, we found that this mouse cursor tracking is actually a really reliable proxy for how people habituate in the brain. So you don't have to have a really expensive MRI scanner. If you use something like mouse cursor tracking, you can deploy this outside the lab at scale, and it works just about as well. And we also used response time, just how quickly they clicked. And we also used warning adherence, or in this case, click-through rates. So at what rate were they ignoring these warnings? So here's our first results image. In this figure, you can see mouse cursor reaction times, how quickly they're moving the mouse. And in red, you see a classic J curve along the bottom, where at first people responded relatively slowly, but as each exposure increased, they got faster and faster. And it kind of bottoms out towards the end. After 15 exposures, it's pretty much flat, that line. And then on top of that, we show a security message at the beginning, at the first position, and the last position, the 15th position. And in each case, reaction times increased from the first to the very last position, and especially so for those warnings that looked similar to the performance message. And at the same time, if just measuring reaction speed, this is just how quickly they're responding. This speed measured in how many pixels they traversed, that went up. So their speed increased from the first position to the last position, and you'd expect all of this. And then finally, the warning behavior, the actual adherence, this increased as well. So the click-through rate was much higher at the 15th position compared to the first position. And across all of this, that foil condition that had nothing to do with the other warnings that didn't look the same, that speed did not increase. And the click-through rate for that message did not increase. So that effectively rules out the possibility that people were just tired of these messages after 15 exposures to them. All right, so some takeaways. So first of all, we found that habituation to notifications that don't have anything to do with security or privacy, that they can generalize to security messages. And we also found that the difference in responding is not due to fatigue. It's due to this effect called generalization, that it actually does carry over. We found that the closer the similarity, the greater the generalization. And that's why those messages that look a lot like the performance notification, that people generalize the most to those, even though they had only seen them once in this task. And so the overall implication is that we should be designing security messages to be visually distinct. And you might think, well, that's not that surprising. And yet, when we look at our user interface design guidelines, we don't see that. We don't see that recommendation, and we don't see it in software. That very often security messages look a lot like notifications that people see on a regular basis, either on their computers or on their mobile devices. So we also looked, since the publication of this paper, we looked at a couple other questions. In this case, we looked at this in the lab. For example, for the program committee, some of the feedback we got on this paper was that, well, there's another rival explanation. Maybe people in this task are just really engrossed. They're so into it that they are responding to these messages more quickly. So we did an MRI study to see, well, is there evidence of this generalization happening in the brain? And the other thing we looked at is not just does generalization happen when the look and feel is the same, but in this case we looked at the question, well, can we make generalization happen less if we change the mode of interaction? Change it from what I call click to dismiss. So we performed an fMRI experiment, and in addition to the stimuli I showed you before, these are 3 new ones, or 2 new ones. One of them, you actually have to drag the cursor from one side or the other in order to either accept or dismiss a message. And in another, you have to swipe across this. So these are 2 different modes of interaction. They're not difficult to do, but they're just different. They're different from mousing over and clicking OK. First of all, we found generalization in the brain, or habituation in the brain, in visual processing centers, which makes sense because they're looking at visual stimuli. And this helps to rule out the possibility of someone being just engrossed in the task, because if someone is very engrossed in the task, you would see more neural activation, not less over time. Again, you see kind of this J curve, that there's just less processing in the brain, in the visual processing centers over time. And this is also interesting. We see that there is more generalization for those security messages that share the same mode of interaction, which is click to dismiss, compared to those messages where you have to do something that's different or out of the norm, like dragging and dropping or swiping. And just that very simple change, even though it doesn't really slow down the user's workflow, it actually does make a significant difference in the amount of generalization that occurs. So again, this is another example, I think, of how our brains sometimes work against us in making security decisions. And we can make it a lot easier for our users if we clearly call out privacy messages and security messages so that they stand out, so that generalization doesn't happen. And I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Hey there, Tom Lowenthal from Brave.
Hi.
A question about distinguishing like privacy and security messages. Isn't there a challenge because so many of the decisions that software chooses to present to you have a privacy and security implication? I think your first example was a really good one, right? You classified the do you want to install Java as a less security impact choice, but it's still potentially significant. And if you're using a lot of websites, a lot of the questions that they want to ask you where they want you to make a choice is because there is a privacy trade-off, there is a security trade-off. So obviously your synthetic example of a notification about whether you correctly classified Batman is perhaps unrealistic, but are there obviously things that should have a notification that you need to take an action on where the action is completely insignificant and doesn't require different treatment?
Sure. So you make a good point. I would agree with you that a lot of the notifications we see have a privacy or security implication, but there are plenty of notifications that don't. Like, for example, text message notifications on our phones. We get them constantly throughout the day. They interrupt us constantly, and we're just kind of trained to ignore it and go back to work, or to look at it and then go back to work. So that's just one example, but mobile devices are, I don't want to use the word notorious, but there we go, I just did. So they present tons of messages all the time, and our computers do too. So So I agree with you to an extent, but I think that the number of notifications that don't have anything to do with security or privacy are actually much greater.
Does habituation still apply when there's no action that needs to be taken on the notification? So in your example, you needed to click a blue or white button to dismiss the informational notification. You're sort of now comparing with like a text message notification. Sure, you could choose to reply, but the normal action is you read and then you're done with it, rather than now make a choice. Do you want to install Java or not? Do you want to give access to whatnot? Does it continue across that threshold even if there's no decision-making required for instance, text message ones, which I think is a great comparison?
That's a really good question. We didn't look at that in this study, and this is the first study we've done to look at this problem. Another one would be, what about notifications that don't require user interaction? What about notifications on different devices? Do they cross over from one device to another? I think those are really good empirical questions that we want to look at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll have to go into the lightning talks.
My name is Kevin from Lyft. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, following on that, about the difference between the real-world examples that you showed and the examples from your study, was that the real-world examples, both of them, even the Java one, the default was to fail safe. The default was to not install Java, whereas in your study's examples, the default was the unsafe behavior. Did you look at all at how, like, the effect of changing the default, even just the highlight on the buttons in your study?
That's another really good question. And the answer is no, we didn't. That's something we want to look at in future studies. And this study was more like the baseline. Can we observe it? Can we see it happening? And secondly, can we affect it by changing up the look and feel and the mode of interaction? But that's a really good point, and I'm glad that in many cases, notifications have a safe fail option.